sitting in my car in the parking garage at work when my phone buzzed with a notification I didn't expect to see on a Tuesday morning. It was from the Ring app. Motion detected. Front door. I almost ignored it. I'd gotten plenty of false alerts before: a delivery driver, a neighbor's cat, once just a plastic bag blowing across my porch. But something made me tap it. Maybe instinct. Maybe the same quiet dread that had been sitting in my chest ever since my brother-in-law lost his job 3 weeks earlier and my mother-in-law started calling my husband every single night. The live feed loaded, and there was my sister-in-law standing on my front porch with a cardboard box in her arms and her husband right behind her carrying what looked like a rolled-up rug. My rug? No, wait, not my rug. I didn't own a rug like that. I looked again. It was green, chunky, braided at the edges. I'd never seen it before in my life, which meant they weren't taking something out. They were moving something in. I sat there in my car for probably 30 seconds, not breathing. The timestamp on the app said 9:14 a.m. I had left for work at 7:50. My husband had left even earlier. He commutes an hour out. Our house had been empty for over an hour, and yet my sister-in-law and her husband were on my porch with furniture. I want to tell you, I immediately called the police. I want to tell you, I handled it calmly and efficiently like someone who has everything together. But the truth is, I just stared at my phone screen until the live feed timed out, and then I sat in that parking garage with my hands on my steering wheel thinking, how long has this been planned? Because it had to have been planned. You don't load a braided green rug into a car on a random Tuesday morning without having thought about it first. Let me back up, because this didn't come out of nowhere, even if it felt that way. I bought my house 2 years ago, right after my grandmother passed and left me a modest inheritance. Nothing life-changing. Enough to cover a down payment on a small 3-bedroom in a quiet part of town that I had always liked. I chose the neighborhood deliberately. I drove through it on weekends before I even started looking seriously. I pictured my mornings there, my garden, my life. I was 31 and I had never owned anything, and this was the first thing that was truly, completely mine. My husband, we'd been married about a year at that point, was supportive. He loved the house. He helped me paint the bedroom, and he built the raised garden beds in the backyard, and we had people over for dinner, and it felt like the beginning of something real and good. His family was a different story from the start, but I told myself it was just adjustment. His mother had a way of referring to the house as the kids' place, or sometimes just your situation, never quite acknowledging that it was mine, not ours. Mine. The mortgage was in my name. The down payment was my inheritance. My husband contributed to bills and groceries, and we shared our life, but the house, legally, was mine. She knew this. I know she knew because I had said it plainly once when she suggested we think about the future and consider what happens to the property. I told her the house was in my name, I had a will, and the future was handled. She smiled the way she always smiles, lips pressed together, eyes somewhere else, and changed the subject. Her daughter, my sister-in-law, I'll call her my sister-in-law because that's what she is, and giving her a name would make her feel more real than she deserves in this story. She and her husband had been struggling for a while. He worked in logistics and kept getting laid off. She did bookkeeping part-time, and it never seemed to be quite enough. They'd moved apartments twice in 2 years. My mother-in-law called them between places like it was a temporary condition, like weather. About 8 months ago, I heard through my husband that they were being evicted. I felt genuinely sorry. I said so. I offered to help them research assistance programs. I even offered a short-term loan. Not out of obligation, but because I thought it was the right thing to do. They declined the loan. Or rather, my mother-in-law declined it on their behalf. She said they didn't need charity, they needed stability. I didn't ask what she meant. I should have. 4 months later, my husband mentioned, casually, over dinner, that his sister and her husband had found a solution. Temporary housing. He said it quickly, the way you say something when you're hoping the other person doesn't ask follow-up questions. I ask follow-up questions. He said his mother had offered to help them stay somewhere safe for a few weeks while they got back on their feet. I asked where. He lifted his plate. I said, where are they staying? He said it would only be the guest room, just for a little while, maybe 6 weeks. I put my fork down. Let me be very clear about something. My house has 3 bedrooms, 1 is ours, 1 is my office. I work from home 2 days a week, and I have a whole system in there, a setup I spent 2 years building. And the third is a guest room that I keep clean and comfortable because I like having the option to host people I choose to host. My mother comes to visit twice a year. My best friend flew in last spring and we stayed up until 2 in the morning drinking wine and talking about everything we'd both been avoiding. I love that room. I chose the curtains. I chose the little reading chair in the corner. I chose the lamp. I had not chosen my sister-in-law. I told my husband no. I was not unkind about it. I said I understood his family was struggling and I wanted to help, but opening our home to his sister and her husband without even consulting me first was not something I could accept. We talked about it. Or rather, I explained and he apologized and then he called his mother and I could hear her voice through the phone from across the room. He came back looking like he'd been wrung out. We agreed, no, they would not be moving in. His mother would help them find an alternative. End of discussion. Except apparently it wasn't, because 2 months after that conversation, on a Tuesday morning in early October, my Ring camera caught my sister-in-law and her husband on my front porch carrying furniture into my home. I opened my phone again and pulled up the live feed. They had gone inside. The porch was empty. My front door, the one I had repainted navy blue the first summer I owned the house, was sitting open. I called my husband. He picked up on the second ring and I said, very quietly, "Are you aware that your sister is at our house right now moving furniture in?" Silence. Not surprised silence. Just silence. I said, "Did you know about this?" He said, "I was going to talk to you tonight. My mom said she had a plan and I thought maybe you'd be more okay with it once it was all ready." I hung up. I sat in that parking garage for another 2 minutes. Then I got out of my car, rode the elevator up to my office, walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and found the number for my attorney. I had hired an attorney 8 months earlier when I updated my will after buying the house. I had her card still in my contacts. She picked up and I told her what was happening. She asked a few questions: whose name was on the deed, whether I had any written or verbal agreement to allow anyone to stay, whether there were any witnesses to conversations. I answered all of them. She said, "You need to call the non-emergency police line and report an unauthorized entry, then we'll talk about the rest." I called. I reported. I gave them the address and I told them I had camera footage of 2 individuals entering my home without my permission and that I wanted documentation of the incident. Then I pulled up the Ring app again. Here's the thing about Ring that I hadn't fully thought through when I installed it 6 months ago, right after my mother-in-law started making comments about looking out for the property and keeping an eye on things while you two were at work. I had installed it mostly out of annoyance. Honestly, a low-level quiet annoyance that I told myself was probably nothing. Ring doesn't just record motion at the door. It also shows you interior cameras if you set them up. And I had set up 2 interior cameras, one in the living room aimed at the front windows, one in the hallway, because a neighbor 2 streets over had been broken into last spring and I had gotten scared. I switched to the hallway camera. My sister-in-law was standing in the doorway of the guest room looking at it with her arms crossed. Her husband was behind her. She was saying something. I had the volume up, but the audio was patchy, and I caught the words window and better. And before she gets home. Before I get home. They were planning to have it settled before I got home. The key, by the way. I hadn't given them a key. I had given one spare key to my mother-in-law months ago, specifically for emergencies. She lives 20 minutes away, and I had this vague idea that if something happened, a burst pipe, a package, some kind of actual emergency, it was useful to have someone local who could get in. That key was not an invitation. It was not a permanent loan. It was not permission to distribute to her children like a landlord handing over units. She had given it to them, without asking me. Without telling me? I don't know if she thought I wouldn't notice or if she simply decided that what she thought was right overrode what was mine. The police arrived at my house at 11:07 a.m. I know because I was watching the Ring camera when I saw the cruiser pull up outside. I had stayed at work. My attorney had advised me to let the police handle the initial contact. "You showing up right now might escalate things in ways that don't serve you," she said. "Let them be the ones who look like they're caught because they are." I watched the whole thing on my phone in a conference room with the door closed. The officer knocked. My sister-in-law answered the door and I watched her face go from casual to confused to something I can only describe as the expression of a person who has just realized the plan was not as good as they thought it was. The officer asked for the homeowner. She said her brother's wife owned it. The officer asked if she had written permission to be on the property. She said her brother had told her it was fine. The officer asked if she had anything in writing. She looked back at her husband. He shook his head slightly. The officer took down her information and my mother-in-law's information. My sister-in-law called her while the officer was standing there. I could see the phone pressed to her ear and generated a report. They were asked to leave. They left. My sister-in-law carried out the braided green rug. Her husband carried out 2 bags and a lamp I didn't recognize. My front door was closed. The porch was empty again. I sat in the conference room for a long time after that. Not because I was unsure of what I'd done. I was completely sure. But there is something exhausting about being right in a situation where you should never have needed to be. When I got home that evening, I walked through every room slowly. The guest room had been partially rearranged. My reading chair had been pushed to the corner. The small dresser moved to make space. I moved everything back. It took about 10 minutes. Then I sat at the kitchen table and thought about my husband. He had known. He hadn't just stayed quiet about a plan he disagreed with. He had known, probably for weeks, and had decided to let it happen and explain himself later. Once it was already done, he'd said. He thought if I came home to a fait accompli, I would soften. He thought I would look at his sister sitting in my guest room and think, well, what's done is done. He had seriously misunderstood who he married. He came home at 6:45. I was still sitting at the kitchen table. I had made dinner. I don't know why, habit maybe, or the need to do something with my hands, and his plate was across from me and the food was getting cold. He sat down. He lifted the plate. He didn't touch it. I let the silence sit for a moment and then I said, I need you to understand what happened today and what's going to happen next. He started to say something. I know, I'm sorry, I should have. And I held up my hand. You knew they were coming, I said. You knew for at least a week, probably more. You let your mother give them my key. You said nothing. And when I called you this morning, your first instinct was to say you were going to talk to me tonight after it was already settled. He nodded. He looked genuinely sorry. I believed that he was sorry. But sorry doesn't reroute a plan that's already been executed. Your family decided that my answer, which I gave clearly and directly 4 months ago, didn't count, I said. Your mother decided that the key I gave her for emergencies was permission to let your sister into my house. Your sister decided that showing up with furniture was a reasonable way to handle a housing situation. And you decided to let all of it happen and see what I'd do about it. He said, I just didn't want to keep fighting about it. I said, so you let them fight for you. He was quiet. I told him I had spoken to my attorney. I told him the incident was documented. I told him his mother would not be receiving a new spare key under any circumstances ever again. I told him that if his sister needed housing, the options available to her were every option that did not involve my address. And then I told him something I had not planned to say, but that had been sitting in my chest for hours, maybe longer. I need to know if you're in this marriage or in your family's corner, because I can't keep building a life with someone who treats my house like a community resource for your relatives. He didn't answer right away. I didn't push him. Some answers need space to become honest. What happened in the weeks after that is its own story, and maybe I'll tell it another time. What I will say is this: my mother-in-law called me 3 times that first week. I let every call go to voicemail. The messages were a progression, first confused, then aggrieved, then quietly furious. Then, by the third one, something that almost sounded like an apology but was structured entirely around explaining why she had done what she did. I saved all 3. My attorney said to save everything. My sister-in-law never called. Her husband texted my husband asking if there was anything they could do to smooth things over. My husband, to his credit, said no. The locksmith came on a Thursday. I had the front door lock replaced, the side door, and the garage keypad code changed. My mother-in-law was not given a new key. She will not be receiving one. If there is ever a real emergency, there are neighbors on both sides of me who have my number and who I actually trust. I kept the Ring cameras. I added one more, aimed at the driveway. There's a version of this story where I tell you that everything worked out and we all sat down and had a difficult but ultimately healing conversation and came out the other side understanding each other better. Maybe that version gets told someday. But that's not where I am right now. What I know is this: I worked for the life I have. I grieved my grandmother and I handled her affairs and I made a decision about what to do with what she left me, and I chose a house in a neighborhood I loved because I wanted a place that was mine, not a shelter, not a favor. Mine. No one gets to walk through that door unless I open it. I learned that you can love someone and still hold the line. That mercy without boundaries isn't mercy. It's just an open invitation for people to take what they wouldn't have dared to ask for. That when you tell someone no and they ignore it, they're not confused. They just decided your no didn't apply to them. My reading chair is back in the corner of the guest room where it belongs. The lamp is on. Sometimes I go in there and just sit for a while in the quiet and look out at the backyard my husband helped me build. And I think about what it means to protect something you love and what it costs you when you finally do. The house is still mine, so is the decision about who gets to be in it.